In this video, we will discuss different tips on how to know which method to use when solving a quadratic equation. So here are a few tips. So if you are trying to use a quadratic formula, a good time to use a quadratic formula is when you have a quadratic equation that looks in this format. So typically, whenever the coefficient of the x squared term is bigger than 1, that's typically a good time to use the quadratic formula. Method 2, we have factoring. Factoring would be good if you have a greatest common factor in which you could pull out. So for example, ax squared plus bx equals 0. Here they both have an x in common that you can factor out. So if you see something like that, where you find that every term has something in common, then you can pull out the greatest common factor. Another method is using the property of square roots of equal numbers, meaning you take the square root of both sides to solve. For this one, you want just an x squared term, and you want a constant. So the x squared term can have a number in the front, that's fine, but if it has another term where it has like bx, some other x term, then you are going to want to use some other method. But here we just have an x squared term, and then the c is a constant, so we can use the property of square roots to solve this one. Next we have completing the square, and completing the square would work well if you have x squared plus bx plus c, where the first term is just x squared with no coefficient. Okay, and then also we'd want this middle term to be an even number, because to complete the square I need to take half of this middle number and then square it. So if you have an odd number here, when you take half of that, it's going to be a fraction, and then when you square that, it's going to be a fraction as well. So completing the square would be good if you have a coefficient of 1 with the x squared term, and the x term has an even number. And by the way, I should note that there's not always just one method that you can use, but you could have multiple methods that would give you the same answer. So the question is, which method would be the easiest to use? So here we have a few examples where you will have to determine which method would be the best approach to solve the equation. Here we have 15x squared minus 60 equals 0. Now this one, actually two methods would work well. First method would be factoring. Notice both terms have a 15 in common. So I could factor a 15 out and be left with x squared minus 40, or minus 4, sorry. And then from here, we can solve. We can factor the x squared minus 4. It's the difference of squares to get x minus 2 times x plus 2 equals 0. So this would work, and then set each part equal to 0. Obviously 15 would not be 0, but the x minus 2 could equal 0, or the x plus 2 could equal 0. So my answer could be x equals positive 2, or x equals negative 2. So this would be one good approach to solving this equation. Another approach we could use is using the property of square roots, where we could get the x squared term by itself, so we can add 60 to both sides. So isolate the x squared term, we would get 15x squared equals 60, and then get the x squared term completely by itself by dividing both sides by 15. We now have x squared equals 4. At this point right here, we could take the square root of both sides. So we have x over here, and then on the right side, we have a positive or negative square root of 4, which would be 2. So my final answer would be x equals positive 2 or negative 2. So notice either method that we use, we still get the same answer. And we could even use quadratic formula, which would be a lot more difficult. Quadratic formula, you would have to have 15 as your a value. There's no b value, so b would be 0, and then c would be negative 60, and plug those numbers into the quadratic formula. But this method right here is probably the easiest method to use. Next, we have y squared plus 2y minus 24 equals 0. This one factors right away because we can factor this to be y times y, which would give me y squared. And then the two numbers that multiply to get negative 24, if we do a positive 6 and negative 4, that would multiply to get negative 24 and would add to give me the middle term of 2. So I can factor very quickly, and from here just set each part equal to 0. Y plus 6 equals 0, and y minus 4 equals 0. We'll solve each one. Y would equal negative 6, or y would equal positive 4. So this one you can factor very quickly to get our solution. And if you did not see that, you could have done quadratic formula, you could have done completing the square. Either of those would have worked as well, but this method is the easiest. Next we have 4y squared plus 12y minus 9 equals 0. So for this one actually would factor, but many times this would be difficult to factor if you do not see this right off, because we have a coefficient bigger than 1 in the front. So yes, you could factor, but if you do not see that, or are not very good at factoring with the coefficient bigger than 1, what you could probably do is quadratic formula. Quadratic formula would probably be the easiest. Completing the square would not be very nice because I have to divide everything by 4 to get this first term to be y squared. And when I do that, I'd have 9 over 4 right here, which would create a fraction. In addition, we have a 3y in the middle after dividing by 4. And then you have to take half of that and square it to get 9 over 4, which would be another fraction, which would not be easy. So quadratic formula is probably the easiest method to use. And for this problem, I'm not going to take the time and walk you through the solving process, because our main objective is to determine which method would be the easiest to use. So quadratic formula would probably be the easiest method. Now lastly, we have x squared minus 4x minus 9 equals 0. So this one, the first thing you want to check is factoring. See if you can write this as a product of two binomials. So like something where you have two terms in two different parentheses. But for this one, factoring would not work. Quadratic formula always works, but it gets a little tedious sometimes. For this example, completing the square would probably be the easiest. And like we said, the quadratic formula would work if we wanted to. But using completing the square, this would be not too bad because this middle number is an even number. Okay, so to do this with completing the square, you'd have to bring this negative 9 to the right side. And you do that by adding 9 to both sides. So now we have x squared minus 4x equals 9. And to complete the square, I add a number on both sides. That number I find by taking half of this middle number here and squaring it. So half of negative 4 is negative 2. Square negative 2 to get a positive 4. Alright, so you add 4 here. And this worked pretty nicely because this middle number is an even number. And then at this point we could do x minus 2 squared on the left side. The right side we have 13. And now we take the square root of both sides. We now have x minus 2 on the left equals a plus or minus square root of 13. Then we can add 2 to both sides. We now have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 13. So this would be my final answer. And as we said, this method, the completing the square method, would be the easiest probably. And that's because this first number with the x squared term, there's a coefficient of 1. And then this middle term is an even number, which means I will not have a fraction when I complete the square.